your host. I'm Simone Absalom. The session will start with prayers followed by a roll call of those in attendance. This is usually followed by questions and answers to questions, statements by ministers, items under public business, and private members' motions. Before we begin, let's try a Parliament trivia. The Most Honourable Sir Howard Cook was Jamaica's 5th Governor-General. Is this fact or fiction? Stick around for the answer at the end of this introduction. The answer will also be posted on our Facebook page. On the agenda in this session, Parliament will complete the legislative process for the extension of the current state of emergency in the St. Catherine North Police Division to January 2 when the House meets. The final process should be simple, with no amendments arising from last Friday's debate, which was approved on the basis of the 19 of the 21 members of the Senate approving the extension, with 2 absentees from the voting. The extension of the St. Catherine SOE becomes effective on October 3. The House will also deal with a number of other resolutions, including private members' motions from Government Member of Parliament Heroy Clark, Member of Parliament for Central St. James, seeking to have the National Housing Trust Act and regulations amended to make the process feasible for low-income earners to access NHT loans. Opposition Member of Parliament Ronald Thwaite's private member's motion number 3, seeking to determine a policy for use of local produce in the school feeding program. And number 47, seeking to have Parliament establish a law school at the University of Technology, UTech. Also under private members' motion, support by the Parliament for consideration for the next CARICOM Heads of Government meeting. Private members' motions number 9, 10, 11, 21, and 22, as well as 26, seeking the House approval on its deliberations with regards to the reports of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, PAAC. It should be noted that the agenda can be adjusted, with items being added or removed or even replaced. If you're planning to attend a session at Gordon House, here are some rules you should keep in mind. No visitor shall create any act of disorder within the precincts of the House. No visitor shall be admitted to the House without first obtaining an admission card from the office of the clerk. Visitors who remain within the precincts of the House during a suspension of the session are asked to keep silent. It's about time to go over to the proceedings, but first, the answer to our Parliament trivia. We asked, the Most Honourable Sir Howard Cook was Jamaica's 5th Governor-General. Is this fact or fiction? It's a fact. He was the 5th Governor-General of independent Jamaica. Thanks so much for making it, PBCJ. Do continue to watch the proceedings.
Mr. Redmond. Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright.
Members, let me remind you that Parliament has resumed and we are sitting to carry out the business of the House. Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, before we commence today, I want to draw to the attention of this Honourable House the passing of the father of one of our members of Parliament, the member from Central St. James. Notwithstanding that sadness within his family, he has bravely agreed to make a presentation here today in a resolution which stands in his name. And we regard that as the kind of courage and steadfastness and commitment to the process of governance that only he can display at this time. So I would ask, Mr. Speaker, that this Honorable House pays due regard and respect, extending our condolences to Eroy Clark, the member from Central St. James.
Mr. Speaker.
Members, I would like to bring to your attention Mr. Paulwell.
Mr. Speaker, I had also wanted to join with the leader of government business in extending on behalf of the opposition our sympathies as well to the member from Central St. James on the passing of his father, and to wish him and his family members all the best as they go through this period of bereavement. I had also wanted to mention, to bring to the attention of the House, the passing of the former Speaker of this chamber, the Honorable Hedley Cunningham, who served in this chamber for a number of years and occupied this seat that you now occupy in a most distinguished manner. And as is customary, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure other members would like to share a brief tribute in relation to Mr. Cunningham.
Yes, members, for Dr. Phillips speak, I think it should be the responsibility of the Speaker to recognize that Mr. Cunningham had passed, and I was about to do so for you, if you would allow me to do that. We know Mr. Cunningham as a former parliamentarian and Speaker of the House, of whom many in this House who know him can say we were very proud of his performance. He was a fair man who possessed a keen wit. He represented Jamaica on the international stage, including serving as Vice Chairman of the Executive Committee on the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Mr. Cunningham, who represented Westmoreland Northeastern before the boundary was revised in 1992. An illustrious career as an attorney, appointed a QC in 1990 and a member of the Jamaica's Privy Council in 1998. On behalf of all of us, I want to extend condolence to the members of his family, his colleagues and friends, and pray that his soul rest in peace. Dr. Phillips, and then Mr. Samuda.
Mr. Speaker, you have summarized well the life and work of the Honorable Hedley Cunningham. I think it would be worth mentioning, in addition to the facts that you have mentioned, his parliamentary career, his role as the Speaker in the House, his exemplary presence at the bar, which led him to the presidency of the Cornwall Bar Association. It's worth mentioning, Mr. Speaker, the exemplary qualities that he brought to bear in his public life. He was a stickler for integrity, and he exercised it in ways that often caused not only high regard to be placed upon him, but when he brought it to bear in his role as Speaker, I think those of us who were on the government side then felt that he was so even-handed that some of us felt impaired by his view of the exercise of fairness. Because and in fact there was a colleague of his at the bar and a then Minister of Government who objected so strenuously to his exercise of his responsibilities as Speaker that it caused an impasse which took many weeks and many meetings to resolve. And I think that in so exercising his duties, he emphasized that in his view, he was the guardian of the principles of the House and the impartiality of the presiding function, more so than a supporter of his political side at the time. And I think that that is an example that has served us well and has been carried on by subsequent occupants of the chair. Edley Cunningham was of an age when service was more important than any personal benefit. He was a man who throughout his life, even after public service, always saw fit to involve himself in the affairs of his community and was very much involved in the bar and the conduct of the bar even after his retirement from active participation. I would ask, Mr. Speaker, that you would ask the clerk of the House to convey to his family the sentiments of the House and our best wishes to them and our expectation that he shall have eternal peace. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to associate myself particularly and the members of the government in the expressions of sympathy expressed by the Leader of the Opposition in respect of the passing of our late Speaker, Edley Cunningham. As someone who served in this honorable House with him for the entire duration of his leadership of the House, I can attest to the fact that he would easily be numbered among the finest who have ever occupied that chair in which you sit. His sense of balance and fair play, his level of impartiality in handling the affairs of this House, but his quiet but firm resolve to ensure that discipline prevails in the precincts of this chamber is something that I will always recall. I also recall many conversations that I had with him downstairs at lunch when he explained the challenges that faced some of his previous adversaries and the manner in which he engaged them in a most impartial and supportive way made me very, very made me warm to him quite significantly. Edley Cunningham was a fine parliamentarian, a very distinguished man who carried himself with dignity. And I think it is fair to say that this Honourable House, in recalling the contribution that he has made to Parliament and to the people of Jamaica, we can say thank God for the life of Edley Cunningham. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
We are going to request members to stand 1 minute in remembrance of the former speaker. May his soul rest in peace. Before we proceed, I think that the leader of government business had brought to the attention of the House that one of our members' father has passed. And just to separate the fact that one was a parliamentarian and one was not. On behalf of the rest of us, we wish to extend our sympathy to Mr. Clark, our member, and his family. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following: Ministry Paper number 91 and Independent Commission of Investigations First Quarterly Report, January to March 2018. Ministry Paper number 92, an Annual Report of the General Legal Counsel for the year 2016-2017. Green Paper number 3 of 2018, entitled National Policy for the Environmentally Sound Management of Hazardous Waste, December 2017. Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica for the year 2016-2017. Annual Report of the Nutrition Products Limited for the year 2016-2017. Annual Report of the Overseas Examination Commission for the year 2016-2017. The Emergency Powers Regulations under the Emergency Powers number 3 Regulations 2018. The Proclamation. Proclamation by the Queen, by the Governor General, for the state of emergency. I think that was just...
Mr. Speaker, the clerk announced 7 items laying table of the House. A very critical one is the report from the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. And we have an understanding that when we have such documents laid in the table of the House, we'd have had at least 12 copies, 12 odd copies. I haven't seen a copy in front of me that has to deal with the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. And I'm wondering when I can see a copy in front of me, because at least the leader of the House, the Speaker of the House, leader of the House, leader of opposition business, The leader of the opposition, the Prime Minister, and myself as Deputy Leader of the House should have a copy, I believe. And I haven't seen any in front of us. That's an understanding we have over the years since we stopped laying hard copies. So I'm wondering, when can I see a copy in front of me?
Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Tripp.
May I strengthen the observation of the minister who just spoke and make a suggestion? On a matter of broad importance, I understand his request and would concur with it. The announcement was made today of the annual report of Nutrition Products Limited, which is a division of the Ministry of Education, in which I have some interest. And I would like to make a suggestion to you that where announcements, reports, papers are laid in respect of a particular portfolio, that if the persons in the House who are connected with that, either the Minister or Minister of State and the opposition counterpart, if they could be provided with printed copies, it would be very helpful, and it would make it easier for us to have access to those things.
Honourable House of Representatives, that on the 21st day of September 2018, a bill entitled An Act to Validate and Confirm as Lawful the Imposition, Calculation and Collection of Spectrum Regulatory Fees in good faith and inadvertent as to the imposition, calculation and collection of such fees being invalid, improper or without lawful authority during the period commencing on the 1st day of April 2004 and ending on the 22nd day of March 2017, to indemnify the government and all other persons from liability in relation thereto and for connected matters, was passed in the Senate without amendment. Signed, Thomas Tavares Vincent, QC, CDJP, President of the Senate.
Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally. Mr. Tweed.
May it please you, Mr. Speaker. May I introduce the following three motions? Be it resolved that this Honourable House cause to be carried out a cost-benefit analysis of the Jamaican bauxite and alumina industry in order to determine the prudent and efficient use of this diminishing natural resource. Second, be it resolved that this Honourable House examine the present and future viability of the cane and sugar industry in Jamaica. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, be it resolved that this Honourable House examine the present viability and future prospects of the Jamaican coffee industry.
Questions and answers to questions.
Mr. Speaker, I'm to advise the House that there are 8 questions to be answered. 2 from the Member of Parliament from Central Manchester, 3 from the Member of Parliament for East Kingston and Port Royal, and 2 from the Member of Parliament for Central Kingston. Mr. Speaker, we are not in a position today to answer those questions, notwithstanding my undertaking to have at least the ones standing in the name of the member from Central Manchester taken today, because the person to whom these questions are addressed is not in the island but attending the United Nations session. That is the Prime Minister. But I give my undertaking that every effort will be made to have these questions answered, hopefully, in the next sitting of the House.
Mr. Speaker, at the expiration of 21 days, would the Minister of Industry, Agriculture, Commerce and Fisheries answer the following questions in my name?
Mr. Speaker, at the end of 21 days, I would like the Minister of Finance to answer the following questions in relation to the Bauxite Levy Act.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read for a first time a bill shortly entitled the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, Order 2000, Validation Act 2018.
A bill shortly entitled the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, Order 2000, Validation Act 2018, read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of a second reading of the bill. And I further beg, Mr. Speaker, to give notice that at a later stage today, the Leader of the House will move for a suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the second reading of the bill and take it through all its concluding stages.
Mr. Shamiudu. I said public business already. Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of standing orders to enable the Minister of Finance and the Public Service to take second reading of the bill, notice of which he gave earlier, and also for him to take it through all its concluding stages.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Clark.
Today I rise to introduce the debate on the bill entitled the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, Order 2000, Validation Act 2018. The bill, Mr. Speaker, seeks to validate and confirm as lawful the vesting of assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited pursuant to the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, Order 2000, which, although signed by the then Minister, was not published in the Gazette. Mr. Speaker, a request was made for the transfer of assets from Knutsford Capital Merchant Bank Limited to Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, now called Sagicor Bank Jamaica Limited, in the year 2000. The then Minister of Finance, exercising the power conferred upon him by Section 35 of the Financial Institutions Act 1992, which has subsequently been repealed and replaced by the Banking Services Act 2014, appointed the transfer of assets on the 31st day of May 2000. After a request was made in 2017 for a gazetted copy of the vesting order, the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, Order 2000, an extensive search was conducted at our offices, at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, at the offices of the Jamaica Printing Services, at the Ministry of Justice's Law Revision Secretariat, at the libraries of the Cabinet Office, and at the Houses of Parliament, but a gazetted order was not located. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is only fair to assume that, well, it is assumed that the order was not gazetted. Mr. Speaker and members of this Honorable House, as you are aware, even though the vesting order was drafted and signed, it would not have full legislative effect because it was not gazetted as at June 6 in the year 2000. According to Section 31 of the Interpretation Act, in order for the vesting order to come into operation as law, it has to be gazetted. Since the Financial Institutions Act has been repealed and did not allow for retrospective operation, the order cannot be gazetted under the repealed enactment. As such, the only way to have the relevant vesting order considered to be of full legislative effect as at June 6, 2000, is for the enactment of this validating legislation. The Memorandum of Objects and Reasons indicates that the bill seeks to validate and confirm as lawful the vesting of assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited pursuant to the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited Order 2000. The provisions in this bill seek to declare that the vesting of assets by Knutsford Capital Merchant Bank Limited in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited pursuant to the vesting order which was without lawful authority, is now valid and lawful as if authorized under the Financial Institutions Act. Mr. Speaker, I ask this Honorable House to give due consideration to the passing of this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Golden. Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have no objection to this bill being passed today. It is really essentially regularizing an oversight that took place 18 years ago. In a sense, it's bizarre that something so minor should require legislation to be put right, but that is in effect what the law requires, and we have no objection to the regularization being done now. Thank you.
Dr. Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the bill be read a second time.
Oh, I thought you weren't hearing. I understand. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? As of it.
A bill entitled An Act to Validate and Confirm as Lawful the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, Order 2000, dated the 6th day of June 2000, and for connected matters, read a second time.
The House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause. Members, I put clause 1. Those in favor? Members, please. I wish that you would attend to the business of the House. I put clause 1. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put clause 2. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put clause 3. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put the preamble. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Members, I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the bill be read a third time and passed.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Clerk.
A bill entitled An Act to Validate and Confirm as Lawful the Financial Institutions Vesting of Assets in Pan-Caribbean Merchant Bank Limited, Order 2000, dated the 6th day of June 2000, and for connected matters, read a third time and passed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion.
Dr. Clark. Just hold a minute, please.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister has sought to have discussions with the Leader of Opposition Business to facilitate the taking of this bill, because at the moment the copies are in transit to the House. But he has 2 copies which he has declared which passed. Ask Mr. Speaker for recommittal of announcements.
The motion is that announcements and notice of motion be recommitted. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Minister.
You go ahead.
Announcements.
Also laid on the table of the House today is the first supplementary estimates for 2018-2019. The Government of Jamaica Fiscal Policy Paper for financial year 2018-2019, interim report dated 25th September 2018.
Notices of motion given orally. Dr. Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be it resolved that the first supplementary estimates of expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2019, which was laid on the table of the House on the 25th day of September 2018, be referred to the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give further notice that at a later stage today, the Leader of the House will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Shamuro.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable the Minister of Finance and the Public Service to take the motion, notice of which he gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I now move the following motion. Be it resolved that the first supplementary estimates of expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2018, which was laid on the table of the House on the 25th day of September 2018, be referred to the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Mr. Shamiru.
Mr. Speaker, it is the intention to request of the Appropriations Committee that they meet on Thursday in order to examine the matter. This Thursday. Can't? Why? Well, when would they meet? All right. Is it agreed on Tuesday morning? No, acting as the House leader, the opposition. But we really can't delay the affairs of the House for you to. Mr. Speaker, the Appropriations Committee will meet on Tuesday at 10 a.m. to consider.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, at a meeting today, at our External Affairs Committee meeting, it was already scheduled to have a meeting to examine one of the agencies.
Mr. Speaker, the member is saying that the Internal External Committee is scheduled to meet next week, Tuesday morning at that time. Can you advise us as to, based on Standing Order 77 subsection 7, what item was referred to that committee to discuss next week Tuesday morning at that time? You cannot supersede it because this is being referred now to a committee. And I don't recall any item being referred to that committee. And the Standing Order makes it clear that as Committee of Parliament shall deliberate on issues referred to it by the House. And that was never done.
Mr. Speaker, I think the matter having arisen, the chairman of the PAC is within the precincts of the Parliament to allow me to consult, and we'll revert before we get too far in the other agenda items.
Listening summon to that meeting. So,
Mr. Speaker, this member does not understand what I'm talking about. You see him talk over his head. I asked the question, what issue was referred to that committee? I'll invite the member to hold me Standing Order if he has one. Standing Order 77 subsection 7 tells you clearly how a committee meets. So don't tell me what you're going to consider. A committee does not determine this stuff. 77 subsection 7 tells you clearly how issues are dealt with in committee, and Standing Order 77A tells you how the reference can be made. Shut your mouth.
Mr. Speaker, No, Mr. Speaker.
Members, let's have some order.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, the member is not correct in that the Internal and External Affairs Committee is a sessional committee, and it doesn't need any specific item to be referred to it. It is always in session. It carries its own agenda and determines its own agenda, and if they and of course the terms of reference are pretty broad. Mr. Speaker, we have to schedule the meeting of the PAC, and I would urge that there be the consultation before we set the time today. All right?
So, Mr. Paulwell, if a matter is referred to the committee by the House Leader, you're advising us that the committee will be taking other matters other than what is referred to earlier. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Speaker, I advise the House that the committee will meet.
Members, let's have some order if I can hear the member speaking.
I advise the Leader of Opposition Business that the committee will meet on Tuesday at 10 o'clock to discuss and to review the matter brought by the Minister of Finance. In the event that they are unable to get sufficient members to attend, we don't have a problem, because the members that represent the government will be sufficient to convene the meeting and have the matter attended. But we are not inclined. We are not inclined to permit.
Order, please.
We are not inclined to permit this level of gamesmanship.
Mr. Samuda.
To deal with a matter of this
importance. Mr. Samuda, please. If a committee meets and the chairman is not present, the committee will select a chairman to proceed. Next item. Next item. Mr. Samuda, you have the next item, please. Let's have some order in the House. Mr. Samuda.
What happened to these microphones? Yeah, Mr. Speaker, today we have a number of resolutions, of motions, that were laid in this honorable House that we will now proceed to ask those members to open the debate. I'm going to call on the this one isn't working. Oh. Yes, I'm going to call on the member from Central St. James to commence the debate on the motion standing in his name.
Mr. Speaker.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I rise today in this humble house to humble and honorable house.
Humbly right.
Mr. Speaker, I humbly rise in this honorable house today to take the matter under my name, the motion, as it is,
whereas one of the main objectives of the National Housing Trust is to provide shelter for low-income earners, and whereas several eligible contributors to the trust are unable to access benefits on the grounds that they cannot afford the 10% deposit for down payment upon signing a contract for sale, and whereas in many of these cases, eligible beneficiaries are entitled to 100% of the benefits award, and whereas in addition to the deposit aforesaid, beneficiaries are further burdened with the requirement for the payment to the trust of contribution towards other miscellaneous expense, to wit administrative expense, which can amount up to 1% of the award, and whereas eligible beneficiaries are further burdened by closing costs, to wit 0.5% stamp duty, 0.5% registration fees, and 3% attorney's fees, plus general consumption tax thereon. And whereas as a result of these front-end expenses, several beneficiaries have found it necessary to either abandon the award or to apply to secondary financial institution for second mortgages or loan. Be it resolved that this Honorable House recommend that the National Housing Trust Act and regulations be amended with a view to making the process of accessing loans by low-income earners more feasible. Mr. Speaker, the disadvantages of the current situation as it stands. Not all working individuals contributing to the NHT is eligible for housing. 2, age and salaries becomes a factor when one is to benefit from their contribution. 3, mostly middle-income earners have a greater chance of accessing housing facility. 4, current program encourages informal settlement, that is squatting, as it is easier to build on vacant land, which in turn becomes criminal hotspot or garrisons. 5, because of difficulty in qualifying, persons become reluctant to contribute to the fund. 6, currently the amount dispersed is not sufficient, hence contributors have to join together. 7, current program leads to unequal distribution of housing. The advantages of this motion, Mr. Chairman, more low-income earners will be able to access housing facility and would lead to equal distribution of housing. 2, it deters informal settlements. 3, it encourages compliance in terms of contribution. 4, increasing funding that the trust would have available to use. 5, household will be more at ease in terms of financial survival, not having to use all their resources to acquire housing facility. Mr. Speaker, the constituency that I represent most immediately and wider Jamaica, sir, is burdened. They are between middle income and low income. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, it hurts when they ask you, MP, are you able to assist us in getting one of the houses or one of the many houses? Too often, Mr. Speaker, those who really don't need the housing solution are the ones that are already qualified, and those who really need it, Mr. Speaker, are left. When you look at a situation where a 45-year-old gentleman is still living in his mother or his parents' house, all because he's unable to get one of his own. Mr. Speaker, today, I don't wish to speak much, but I would ask my other colleagues to expound on it some more, to make it and to vote on it today, Mr. Speaker, so that we can move forward. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, this is what you want to comment? Yes, Mr. Speaker. Yes, a number of us would like to comment on the motion that was just moved by the member. We are seeking to do so at our next sitting. So if we could suspend this motion until next time we meet, I would appreciate that, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, in light of what the Leader of Opposition Business has said, we have no objection. We have no objection because we think that it is such an important motion that it needs to get the full response of all persons in this Honourable House who will wish to contribute. So we will facilitate that extension. Mr. Speaker, we now have... yes, sorry.
Mr. Semudo, you'd have to move a motion for it to be suspended. So do. Those in favour? Those against? As of it.
Mr. Speaker, we have now the member from Central Kingston who will move the motion number 3 and then number 47, standing in his name. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, let me hasten to say that he will be followed by the member from Western Westmoreland who will speak on the reports of the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee number 9, 10, 11, 21, 22, and 26. The chairman of that committee will be made to do what should have been done several months ago, and he will be making those reports to this Honourable House today. In addition, next week we are going to call on him to do the other report that is his name as chairman of that, to make their presentation and to participate in this parliament in a more fulsome manner. So in that regard, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to call on the member from Central Kingston to make his first presentation.
Mr. Traits.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Thank you, members of the House. The motion that I'll take first is number 3 on the order paper. It has to do with school feeding. The other motion, which I'll take afterwards with your leave, is at number 47. It has to do with the establishment of a law school at the University of Technology. I'd like to point out, first of all, that I, for one, am in full support of the motion just offered by the member for Central St. James. And I would reserve the opportunity to speak on it next time, as you have indicated. But a problem is not only that which he has set out regarding the costs and the impact that has on those who are eligible for housing trust benefits, but the fact that the housing industry itself is not providing houses at a cost that is possible for, affordable by, the majority of people who contribute to the trust. That is an even more systemic problem, which I invite you to take into account, along with your existing motion. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, the motion number 3 was moved 2 years ago, barring 3 days. And allow me to please thank you for the opportunity of discussing it, or beginning the discussion now, but to draw the attention of the House. that it really shouldn't take this length of time for a private member's motion to be considered, 2 years, and to ask that we accept the principle that the cabinet, which normally initiates most of the business of this House, is really the executive of Parliament, and Parliament is not the rubber stamp of the cabinet. And accordingly, the representation which each of us must offer to our constituents and to the nation as a whole requires prompt attention alongside all the other business of government. I'd like to continue by indicating that the 22 motions that I have on the order paper, of which this is the first, are put forward in an aim to stimulate discussion on important current issues in Parliament and so promote policy development. They are not put forward in any polemic attitude. They are all consistent with the covenant which the party which I represent has taken to itself and for the people of Jamaica. But I am appreciative, particularly in the issues that are going to be discussed in this motion 3, of the work that is being done by government, and the purpose of raising it is to seek improvements rather than to denounce anyone's activity. Mr. Speaker, the motion reads, whereas more than 80% of the ingredients of the school feeding program have to be imported, and whereas some 30% of all students come to school hungry, and many only have access to a diet with excess sugar and sodium, and whereas children and young people develop lasting dietary habits during their school years, and whereas the traditional Jamaican agricultural products are nutritious and, if used, increase returns to local farmers, be it resolved that this Honourable House debate and determine a policy for increased use of local produce in the school feeding program. And I will ask at a later stage, Mr. Speaker, for an amendment to this, an addition rather, so that the deliberations of this House can in fact be continued by the appropriate committee of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, hunger we define in Jamaica as a lack of appropriate nutrition. It's not the same as hungry belly. Hunger.
1 minute, Mr. Member. You're seeking to have an amendment?
Not at this stage, Mr. Speaker. I'm merely giving notice that when I'm closing, I will do so. And I have indicated what that amendment will be.
But you can't hear too much talking. Too much chattering over there.
Go ahead, please. Member, it is a practice that one of our members is speaking that others either sit quietly and allow him to proceed without disruption. So I'm going to ask that you do so at this time so the member from Central Kingston can proceed without disruption. Mr. Thwaites.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hunger is to be defined for the purposes of this discussion as a lack of appropriate nutrition, which is a major cramp in Jamaica now to education outcomes and therefore to inclusive national development. The statistics tell us that a minimum of 30% of our children, those who attend, come to school hungry every day. And lack of adequate nutrition, for whatever reason, contributes to the approximately 20+% of absenteeism in our schools, in addition to those who come to school hungry. It contributes to inattention and to behavior, which very often is antithetical to the cause of good education. Come with me, Mr. Speaker, to any school. Particularly, I want to make reference to the early childhood institutions and ask the children what they want for lunch or what they expect for lunch, invariably they'll tell you fried chicken and chips or something of that nature. The bag juice and cheese tricks culture is well entrenched in our country. It offers very little positive nutrition and indeed sets a habit and a trend among our students, which has national consequences. What we feed our students determines their taste going through life. It also adds to the drain of foreign exchange. We're spending, nearly $1 billion worth of foreign exchange, more than our entire merchandise exports, Mr. Speaker, to import food. A good
Minister, the Speaker is indicating to me he's been disrupted. And I'm going to ask that you cease from disrupting. Proceed, Mr. Tweed.
A good proportion of what we are spending on importing food items, Mr. Speaker, can be produced locally. The diet of the school children contributes very significantly to obesity and to the prevalence of non-communicable diseases. And what they're eating provides insufficient nutrition for effective learning. The present diet discourages linkages across sectors of the economy. It depresses rural uplift and employment, and it entrenches the fast food culture. One of the things that we have to be most careful of, Mr. Speaker, in our school culture now has been the introduction of the fast food outlets as nutritional franchises, food franchises in our schools, in many of them. What they are serving has no bearing on the correct nutrition to advance learning and for the affordability, particularly of those students of the lowest quintiles of the economy. We have about 650,000 students in school from kindergarten right through to grade 13 in about 4,000 institutions. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if members are aware that almost half of the students who are enrolled in school in Jamaica are on the PATH program. And it is reasonable to assert, it's an informed assertion I make, that there's another 15%. There's another.
I'm going to ask members in this House
Just ask him, Mr.
for the last time. Cannot use telephone in the House. In the House, you must either send text and receive text. But to be dialing and receiving, it's against the rule. As a deputy leader of the House advised us earlier. Let us stand by that. We have been getting a little away from the proper order of the House.
Disrespectful to you, sir.
Disrupting others when they're speaking. Thank you very much. Mr. Tweed, my apology. Please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I was pointing out that about half of the students in our schools are on the PATH program, and that there is ample indication that another 15% beyond that half really need it. But one of the aspects that education faces in Jamaica now is the difficulty to qualify for PATH, and also the need to clean the list of PATH beneficiaries when indeed those parties have gone to a point where they no longer need that assistance. But the point I'm making is that a majority of our students require. It's a joke, man. May I continue, sir?
You may, as I apologize for the disruption.
Mr. Speaker, the government contributes sums in excess of $5 billion a year towards school feeding, and the public should acknowledge the improvement in the allocations for school feeding in recent years. If, however, Mr. Speaker, you estimate a minimum of $300 for lunch money, broadly defined, that a parent or a student needs in order to be properly nourished for the day, multiply that by 650,000 and multiply that by the 190 days for the school year, Mr. Speaker, and you are coming to a sum close to $40 billion a year. That is the size of the school feeding industry in Jamaica. Now, accept that parents will pick up probably a half of that, but then match that against the contribution which the state is so far able to give. I'm not disparaging that for one moment, but I'm pointing out to you that there is a considerable deficit in terms of the capacity of our students to be properly fed, which is an essential ingredient to national health, educational outcomes. Mr. Speaker, 40 billion. 40 billion. Yes, multiplied, sir, Mr. Speaker. I'm estimating, and members may wish to add up, I doubt if you can subtract, $300 a day, yes, is a mean figure for a lunch money. And I'd like to interpose here, sir, in order to explain that, particularly thankful for the attention of the Minister of Agriculture, because our children need not only one meal a day, they need breakfast and lunch, the majority of them. If you did a survey, particularly in the inner city, and I doubt if it's any different in the rural areas, you would find that because of the long commutes and the early hours that the children have to leave for school, what they get at home for breakfast is very limited, if anything. And therefore, when they come to school, they must have some money in order to buy something to start the day, whereas by midday, they are in fact in need of a lunch. And remember that we want them to stay on in school in order to pursue extracurricular activities and so on. And therefore, the capacity, particularly given the number who are on path, require no less than $300. In preparation for this, I did some survey, and among people of limited means, they try to give their children $500 a day. Yes? I reduced it for these figurings to $300. Help me, $300 per day times times 650,000 children. That's the school population, roughly. Times 190 days. You'll come out at somewhere in the region of $37, $38 billion. I rounded it up to $40 billion. Pardon? And that's conservative, Mr. Speaker. Now, what we're doing, to the extent that we're meeting that need, and no one can question that need, what we're doing is fattening foreign farmers rather than our own. And the solution to this problem, which I respectfully bring to this Honourable House, is an issue which is going to demand the linkage between a variety of government ministries. First of all, the Ministry of Education, no doubt, then the Ministry of Health, who must help us to determine the appropriate nutritional ingredients and standards. The work has already been done, but it has not been implemented, or certainly not universally. Beyond that, there is the Ministry of Social Security, which has responsibility for the PATH program. And of course, there's the Ministry of Agriculture. Many years ago, you know, Mr. Speaker, I confronted this problem, and at the time approached the late lamented Minister of Agriculture, the Honourable Roger Clark, and asked him how could there be cooperation to ensure that the agricultural sector could in fact meet the needs of the school feeding program. He was helpful but skeptical. He told me that it would take probably between 5 and 7 years to ramp up production to a point where 40 to 50% of that which we fed to our school children would be available from local produce. I accepted his wisdom, but with some amount of distress. In the intervening years, and this bears no relation to any partisan consideration, we haven't done very well. The large majority of what we feed to our children is still imported from abroad. Efforts have been made, but not successful yet, to ensure that we could have the appropriate tastes embedded and the costs contained and the facilities available for using this local produce. This was an objective that I thought Nutrition Products Limited ought to be able to undertake. Regretfully, they have not been able to, and at present, as the article in the front page of the Daily Gleaner today indicates, the Nutrition Products Limited is in a process of transformation. I put it no higher than that. And they are unable to provide even that which they used to provide. Now, I understand entirely the motivation and the wisdom of the government to reduce, and they say ban, the sweet drinks and to cease the production of the bullers. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, if you're going to do that, you have to make sure that you have a substitute. Otherwise, let me tell you what every one of us would face if we went to the school gates. The children are, in fact, buying the cheese tricks and the bag juice and the bun and cheese when they can afford that. And therefore, we have to be very careful how we suppress one element that indeed needs to be discontinued over time and what we put in its place. And I don't think that any of us have been sufficiently inventive in this regard. Mr. Speaker, may I pause to congratulate and to thank my friend from Northwestern St. Elizabeth, the Minister without portfolio in agriculture, because from many years ago, he and I worked out a system where rather than sending the bulla and the bag juice to certain schools in that constituency, what we did was to provide a certain sum of money which the school could then use under the helpful aegis of the Member of Parliament, in parents, school community, in order that they could use as far as possible local products to feed their children more appropriately than in fact the central ministry was doing. I am elated, and have expressed this elsewhere publicly, that the plan that apparently is at hand for the transformation of the use of the Holland estate and the discontinuance of cane can be used for the same purposes, and indeed in a much wider context. This is exactly what we need to do. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, members of this House, can you imagine how it would stimulate the rural economy, rural employment, the entire agricultural sector, if we were able to use that which we produce and now discard in order to better feed our school children than we are now? The estimates, I stand to be corrected, of farm gate losses are probably about 40% of what we produce. That's something we're paying for, but not getting the benefit of. It's not second class. It is simply not presented, marketed in a way that is useful. There are many very practical suggestions that I would like to place before the members of this House and the government particularly. During the previous administration, I had the pleasure of meeting with Dr. Henry Lowe, the Honorable Dr. Henry Lowe, and he had come up with an extremely good-tasting yam porridge made of Jamaica's yellow yam and other varieties of yam. The portions of yam, Minister, that were not fit for even Coronation Market, the heads, the tails, yes? And to provide a powder which, with the addition of hot water, could provide a nourishing porridge. It was tested for nutritional adequacy, found acceptable. Unfortunately, it was taken no further. There were cost considerations, but they were not, they could be overcome, particularly when you're looking at volumes. That's one. We've had to discontinue the distribution of milk to our children, particularly our young children. Mr. Speaker, sometimes in this house we must acknowledge mistakes, you know. But we caused the decimation of the dairy industry in Jamaica some years ago, when we were beguiled by the promise of cheap milk powder from abroad. And we thought, in our populist excesses, that this was better for us to do. And it upset the entire development of the dairy industry. So now we have to be spending multi-millions clawing back that situation. But we have to find a way that the milk from the small farmer is able to go into the churn as it used to, or whatever modern iteration of that, in order to be able to feed our children some milk, or little children particularly, at least once a week. They're not getting it now. The other area that I want to point out with a measure of warning is that the advertisements in the press must be taken seriously, that there are a number of producers of poultry meat from the United States who, given their surplus now because of the trade tariffs and disputes where the elephants are contending in the developed countries, they are anxious to dump that chicken meat on us. And if we accept it, it may seem attractive. It may even seem particularly attractive to the school feeding program, but it is going to decimate particularly the small farmers in the chicken industry. And it is going to, many risk of taking them in our apparent need, rather than stimulating our farmers to provide a measure of chicken protein, highly desirable, in ways that can satisfy our children. I had the pleasure of discussing this with members of the poultry industry 3 or 4 years ago, and they were willing. But again, there was a built-in resistance at all levels of the state apparatus for doing the radical thing that was necessary to stimulate local production for this means. It was always easier to come to the minister with an import license for so much flour and for so much bully beef, yes, rather than turning on ourselves and ask how we can do that elementary thing of feeding our own children properly. Instead of the fries, the Irish potato fries, nothing wrong with Irish potato. What if, Mr. Speaker, we were in this house to really adopt a posture that said, why don't we use Jamaican sweet potato, wedges, or in some other form, as the carbohydrate that would be in starch that would be so valuable to our children. That grows easily, it is highly nutritious, and it is cost effective. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the international statistics, you will see that Jamaicans, producers of bananas, in fact, consume less bananas than many countries in the north that don't produce one banana. Can we use our bananas to feed our children, either in ripe form or in some other processed form? This is an issue which must be taken up. We approached Jamaica producers at one time to do so. It could revivify, is that a word? It could revive the fortunes of St. Elizabeth, Portland, and St. Mary, Portland and St. Thomas, in ways that no other measure presently on the cards can possibly do. The importance of the school gardens cannot be underestimated in this cause. I had the pleasure of meeting with the 4-H clubs recently, and they need to be invested and committed to a school garden in every single school in Jamaica, urban as well as rural. They can produce the greens that are an essential and palatable staple, understood and liked by our children towards the school feeding program. Many years ago, I had the opportunity of visiting both a plant in St. Elizabeth, which processed vegetables and fruits, and also one in the constituency of Northwest Manchester. Sitting down there, fully equipped, you know, Mr. Speaker, never used, which could process carrots, mangoes, vegetables of all, and fruit of all sorts available for the school feeding program. We have the processing capacity. What we lack is the will and the energy to combine agriculture progressively, may I say prosperously, with the school feeding program. We are spending the money, but we are spending it in the wrong place, nutritionally, economically, and we ought to make a difference in this regard, resolve to make a difference in this regard. Mr. Speaker, just to go back to the question of cost for a minute. If a parent of a single child gives that child $300 a day for lunch money, I haven't even taken into account transportation, you're talking about over a week, 21% of the minimum wage, for that one child alone. That is the gravity of the problem. And it is showing, it is at least a major element in the poor school outcomes that we are talking about. I had an occasion recently to visit the constituency of West Portland. And here are children who have to rise from 4 in the morning to reach Highgate for school, or Happy Grove or Port Antonio for school. And I'm sure that's a duplicated situation. When you have that, they haven't had breakfast yet. They have to make sure that they carry enough money that they can eat something. The present school year has opened in a situation of uncertainty regarding food. I refer to the items in the newspaper today and other anecdotal evidence that with the best will in the world, that food which we have is not reaching all of the schools in the way that they ought to. I am particularly concerned about the early childhood sector, Mr. Speaker, because it is at that age that the nutrition is more important even than any other time. And it is also then that the food tastes of the children are definitively settled. And I ask that we look carefully. The small quantity of wraps that are now available are not sufficient. So water, healthy though it is an unlikely substitute for a sweetened drink or for juice. And the solution requires the close articulation of the various ministries I have mentioned. And also, quite frankly, I long for the promise which I heard in the budget debate of a central marketing organization for agricultural produce, in order that there can be the aggregation of supplies for processing and for distribution. Recipes are available, but they are unattainable because the local produce is simply not at hand in order to deal with it. I urge that we should give principals of schools a great deal of autonomy in respect of school feeding, and it is a responsibility of the nutrition products, not so much to provide solutions, but to provide supervision, to ensure the equity of resources to these schools in order that they may help to ensure that from local resources, particularly in the rural areas, that there be adequate nutrition. Mr. Speaker, no one size is going to fit all of our schools. But what if we clustered schools in zones in order that we might provide better for the items needed for school feeding? There are many other good reasons why we should be clustering our schools in educational zones, and this is a chief one of them. We need to make an intentional effort, Mr. Speaker, and to set targets of 50% of the approved diet over 5 years to be from local products. I'm calling for the ministries, with the assistance of this House and the deliberations of the committee, which I hope will take broad stakeholder responsibility for this, to provide a green paper to the government, or the ingredients of it in due course, for the matter to be referred to the committee to the benefit of the educational prospects of our students. Thank you.
Mr. Hutchinson.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to say that I remember it's about 9 years ago that I was going to say that the member has regurgitated what I had said just about 9 years ago. But as my roommate, I want to say that I agree with what he has said here, and it is one where it is between 30 and 40%
of the students who now go to high school and primary schools, they go to school without a breakfast in the morning. And the member is aware that I had a breakfast program in my constituency where we found that with those who took the breakfast in the mornings were ones whereby we found that the attendance increased greatly, and also the grades of those students jumped dramatically. It is one, therefore, where I have been passionate about to see how we can get it going. And we have been able to get programs in place now, those that he has mentioned. And with that, we find that quite a number of fruits and vegetables go to waste every year. We are therefore putting in place now a program where we have established incubators at RADA offices in 7 parishes. These incubators are to make puree and fruit juice. What is going to happen is that we are getting together committees in every school, and these committees are going to be made up of persons from SDC, 4-H, Old Students Association, PTA, community organizations, farmers organizations, and these are the ones who are going to be in charge of the school garden and the breakfast program. The 4-H are going to be the lead in this, and they are going to be manning the school garden, that anything from the school garden goes into a breakfast program. It is also one where we are finding out that the committees there are also going to be monitoring these children who are coming to school, children to go and work on the farm. We are saying, instead of sending them to work on the farm, come and work on the farm, school, garden, where they can learn at an early age about agriculture. Because this is where we have to go. We have to teach the students at an early age that agriculture is a profitable industry. We are therefore also looking to see how we can go into the value chain. The value chain is one where, as you mentioned, that Holland has closed. And I think everybody knows that Holland has closed. But I have said that under every dark cloud, there is a silver lining. And although there is roughly 220 persons who have been displaced there, I have put together a committee, and that Holland land is roughly 2,400 acres. And what we are going to be doing there now is that we are going to be providing the land to small farmers. No more than 100 acres any one person is going to get. Most of them will be getting roughly 5 acres. We are looking that it is going to be roughly 180 persons who will be on that farmland. The employment will be in the region of 600 persons. These are common laborers who are going to be there. What the question is being asked, when all this produce is coming out on 2,400 acres, where is the market?
What we are therefore looking at is that we are going to be looking over on the other side of Holland Estate, where there's another 400 acres. We are looking to set up a complex. And that complex is one where we are going to be doing grading, packaging, processing, cold storage, drying facilities, so that whatever is produced over on the left-hand side, there is an immediate market over on the right-hand side. The A-grade produce will be going to the hotel and export market. The B-grade produce will be going to the local market. And the C-grade produce, which is usually left in the field, will go then to be processed into puree or juice. And with that, we find that the trash that comes out will then go to either feed or fertilizer. Thank you, sir. You're coming to come. And so with that, we have found that nothing is left there on the farmer's farm. Everything is taken off, and we go directly into the value chain. That is where we are going. And then we have the products that now can then feed back into the school feeding program. All the jams and jellies that might be there, we are looking at more nutritious products. We have farmers within the area, within the organizations, farmers' organization. They will be providing the banana, the yam, the cocoa, dasheen, hot pepper, everything. If it is not being provided in the school garden, farmers within the area will be providing that, not only for the breakfast program, but also for the lunch program. So what we are looking at is getting in place an integrated program whereby we are moving directly from the school, where we are teaching students at an early age, going to the farmers, who will then be providing all the produce necessary to go into the school, including the value chain. So I would like to congratulate the member on this motion that he has brought, and say that I fully endorse it. It is one that I have been pushing for over the years, and I am now glad that someone from over that side, I know from long ago that he was with it because I gave him the blueprint of my breakfast program. But somehow during his term, he never mentioned it at all. I am now glad. I am now glad that he is now coming on board with my program. So carry it forward to make sure that we take it on board, and we all will be on one accord in making sure that this program works for the benefit of the children that we are making for. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in this honorable house to give support to the motion moved by Member Thwaites, former Minister of Education, on the motion here as it relates to the school feeding program. I want to say that it is quite fitting and most appropriate for it to be tabled at this time. I want to say that for myself, this morning I launched a breakfast program in my constituency, and also a school garden program where all the schools will be getting seeds and fertilizers. I have 15 basic schools, 3 high schools, and 18 primary schools, and they will all benefit from the breakfast program which was launched this morning. I want to posit, Mr. Speaker, that most of the social programs that we're having in our country
I would say, although we may not have the imperative data to match it, stem from the food that our students, our children eat in their respective schools. The high sugar content, the salty food that they feed on, the cheese tricks, the sweet drinks, the bag juice. And we are now seeing the ripple effect in our country. We have had to be having several state of emergencies, zones of special operation. And we would also want to say that it stems from that, the sweet drinks, the hypertensive, the hyperactivity of our children. We note, for example, the behavioral problems as myself a recent practitioner in the school. We see where when these children have these sweet products, that they return to the classroom very, very hyperactive. Sometimes they cause tremendous problems to the teachers, to the administrators. And I believe that is a result of this. We need to look at our local foodstuff. As a member said early on, we need to look at the impact on their lifestyles. Many of the diseases that our children are getting now, the hypertension, the diabetes, are caused from the food that they eat in the respective school. We must, Mr. Speaker, look at what is happening as it relates to the concessionaire in our respective schools, because many of them are not practicing healthy lifestyles. I believe that many of them are looking at the bottom dollar. And our children have grown up getting used to the fried foods, the salty foods. And so I would also posit that we need to have an extensive education program in our schools to sensitize our children as it relates to their eating habits. It will also take a lot of stress and strain of the Ministry of Health, the hospitals, as the children we'll have less of them going into these facilities. We would also have our members of parliament also having more funds to spend on activities not related to illnesses, because I can tell you that right across the country when I make visits to the schools and call, that several parents have had to be calling on MPs for assistance for dialysis and for the health-related illnesses which we have to be given from our meager CDF. And so, Mr. Speaker, this cannot be overemphasized as we debate this motion here this afternoon. I am, though, concerned that as we speak, that the school term has not started off well as it relates to nutritional aspect for the students. We know, for example, that the nutrition buildings or products in Westmoreland and St. Mary have been closed. Kingston has been scaled down significantly. And so our students currently in school are not getting what they ought to get. And so we are moving from one extreme to the other, where here they were getting the sweet drinks, the Nutri-Buns and Bullets, and now they are getting nothing. Several schools I visited yesterday are complaining that they have not gotten anything, any nutritional support since school started. That cannot be at all. We are compounding the situation where from the salty and the sweetness, they are now getting nothing at all. And so that will lead to nutritional and malnutrition in our students. And so, Mr. Speaker, as we debate this motion here this afternoon, I give full support. And I know that the Minister of Agriculture is steadfast in looking ahead and what needs to be done. In South Manchester, we have one of the best agri-park, the Duff House New Forest Agri-Park, which is there. In Cano Valley, melons in abundance are produced there. Cantaloupes, cucumbers, carrots. Many times these things go to waste. And I believe that they can be used, put to proper use, to supplement our diet in our schools for our children. So I support this motion wholeheartedly, And I know that good sense will prevail as we move forward to equip our schools and our students with proper nutrition. I thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I stand to endorse what member from Central Kingston has said re the school feeding program. I want to thank the Ministry of Health for what they've been doing in regards to Jamaica Move, because that's moving us away from obesity in Jamaica. And with the school feeding program, I think this would be an asset for our children, as we all know that childhood obesity is on the rise in Jamaica. I too, in West Road, St. Andrew, I have a pretty large constituency, and I have to say that I'm quite proud that I was able to provide a breakfast program in one of my schools, and I've already, after speaking with the principal, seen a difference in the children and their learning ability. I also feel that we have enough local resources. We see so many fruits from time to time rotting on the ground. And I think so, I'm also with the minister stating that they're going to be having a processing plant, I guess, to help with juicing some of these fruits that's going to waste. The herb garden, I am in total agreement with having herb gardens in school and also gardens in school on, and I know that in West Road, St. Andrew, there are quite a number of schools that have a school garden, and I know that that has been helping the children with their needs, with their nutritional needs. I too also feel that while we may have meals provided for our children in schools, the nutritional facts, one of our main problems that we're facing right now, I believe, is not having companies in Jamaica putting the nutritional facts on their packages. And I think while we are moving away or moving with Jamaica Move and child with obesity to prevent those things, we have to educate our children. And in order to educate the children, we have to teach them how to read labels and to properly understand why we're telling them not to consume so much sugar. However, if you just put on a label that the ingredients is just sugar, flour, etc., they will not know or understand the nutritional facts and why and how much they should have. So I am also pushing for that to make sure that companies in Jamaica comply. We know that it is expensive for the smaller companies to get this up and running, but I would love to see where our local snacks that we have in Jamaica on our grocery floors will one day we'll see the nutritional facts on them and not just the ingredients. I also want to see, and I'm in agreement with our children possibly having a more balanced meal in the schools. You know, rice is fine, but as soon as you eat rice, it breaks down as sugar into your body. And if our children are not exercising, then we have the rise of obesity in our children. And so where we have bananas and our local bananas and yams, I think we need to introduce those in our meals in schools and more vegetables. I know that in Jamaica, for all of us, most of us, when we go to some of our cook shops, most of the things that we get is just cabbage. And yes, cabbage is very high in anthocyanins, which we know that it helps in our brain function, and vitamin K. But there are so many other vegetables out there. And even for me, when I go to the grocery store, I am looking for, I'm a lover of broccoli, and I'm looking for local broccoli. And most times it's hard for me to find local produce that's properly packaged in our grocery store. So I want to see more of our local Jamaican vegetables in our school mixed with our local produce and not just rice and fried chicken. Another thing I wanted to talk about, but I think I just lost my train of thought here. Re the breakfast program. Member from Central Kingston spoke about porridge, etc. But I also want to say that we could have fruit plates. We could have fruit plates in our school. We could introduce those. And we have so much local fruits. We have a season for every fruit, more than one kind of fruit. And so I think when we give the children those kinds of fructose, I think it's much better for them to learn as they break it down in their body. And so if it is that schools possibly can't afford the porridge or the hard breakfast, which I am not for, to give our students the hard, heavy breakfast, because that does not help with learning. However, I believe fruits is something that would be more nutritious and would actually help our students. So I want to say that I endorsed your motion, and I hope that some of these things can be implemented. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support my colleague on this motion, which was brought here over 2 years ago, motion number 3 on the order paper. Mr. Speaker, I too want to join myself with some of the comments that have been made so far. I strongly support the arguments put forward by a member from West Rural St. Andrew as it relates to labeling. One of the things we attempted to do in the Ministry of Health was to look at the question of labeling ingredients and also calorific value. We were also able to establish dietary guidelines, which is now established in the ministry as one area to guide us along. But, Mr. Speaker, I am putting on the table that in 2013, this House debated a national food and nutrition policy. We were way down the wicket in that debate, led by Roger Clark as Minister of Agriculture, endorsed by myself as Minister of Health, endorsed by Ronnie Thwaites as Minister of Education. I note, Minister of Agriculture, that it is on the list of things to be done within the Ministry of Agriculture. And I would ask, Minister, that it comes back on the table for debate. It's a far-reaching policy that would cover significant areas that we have discussed. The minister spoke, well, the mover of the motion spoke to the fact that 80% of the things we use in schools now are coming from overseas. It is also a fact, Mr. Speaker, that 60% of the food we eat as a country is coming from overseas. And what that means is that a lot of what we eat is coming from containers and really not from farms in Jamaica. And I do believe that where we are now, if we are to respond especially to the NCD, the non-communicable disease epidemic, it is going to be important what we are feeding our children within schools. I think Minister Tufton has continued with Jamaica Move, and there are other initiatives before But I would say, Mr. Speaker, that where we are now, if we take into account what is happening from the surveys that have been done relative to obesity in our schools, and what is now happening to young children, 12, 13, 14, having non-communicable diseases, diabetes, high blood pressure, the asthmas and other things, that right now, when you take that into consideration, it is a significant cost to the country, because you now have youngsters who are now on medication, many of whom will be on medication for life or for as long as they might live. And it is a view that if we fail to intervene now in relation to this fact, we are going to have serious problems. But again, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to the agriculture sector, I do believe, and I point to the Minister of Agriculture, that if we are able to take on this matter and take it on with a sense of purpose, there is absolutely no doubt that in relation to the agriculture sector, which in 2016 grew by 13.5%, last year a negative growth of 3.8%, and this year with rain and other things, I don't know where we are now, last quarter, but I don't know what we will end up by December. I am just saying that if we have this dedicated market relative to what we need to do in our schools, added to that, we have to look at protective agriculture, because it's not just continuing, because you see what drought, rain has done. So if we are not looking at protective agriculture, we are also putting ourselves at a serious disadvantage that when you have the rains, the drought, the school feeding program comes to a significant challenge. So, Mr. Deputy or Mr. Acting Speaker, I am supportive of this motion. It is well timed. It should be backed up by the National Food and Nutrition Policy, and I believe that a new day and a paradigm shift would come to this country if we are able to move in that direction. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Acting Speaker, may I join the speakers before me in commending the mover of this motion for for laying on the table some years ago what we now debate here today. But Mr. Speaker, I want to follow on the speaker just before me and to recognize that if we are to follow through on this motion and to make something of it, I would want to focus our attention on an aspect of the discussion that we have not so far focused on, which is the supply side. We have spent quite a bit of time looking at the demand side of the equation, and quite understandably so. But, Mr. Speaker, it is not just the ministries of education, health, labor, and agriculture, important, critical as those are, that are key to this, to making a success of this activity, of this program, if we are indeed to succeed. But we have to look very critically at the roles of the ministries of industry and commerce, because it is in that ministry with the key activities of industry and commerce that I believe the failure or success of this endeavor will lie. Because, Mr. Speaker, let us be very clear that an aspect of our governance structure, an aspect of our policy planning that we time and time fail to observe and to follow very carefully is the whole matter of the role for industry and our trade policy. And I believe we ought to have learned some lessons by now. Reference was made to the manner in which our dairy industry was adversely affected by our policies on the dairy industry. We are still struggling with our poultry industry and the policies meeting the correct policy measures in order to ensure that there's a measure of support. And I speak not so much in terms of protection as I speak in terms of support for local industry. It is all well and good, Mr. Speaker, for us to talk in terms of a food security policy. But to have a food security policy that is then undermined by a trade policy that is not coherent or consistent with that food security policy makes very little sense. And it adds up to a lack of incoherent set of policies and undermine the efficiency and the efficacy of the policies and strategies that we are here talking about. And therefore, even as I support the motion, I would think that the appropriate thing to do, I'd love to see that this motion then goes on to the Human Resource Committee, where it is looked at and a number of other integrating activities be brought together. Because if we devise a policy and a strategy that is devoid of the coherence that is needed, then we're going to have a very serious problem in sustainability. And I think at the moment, even as we speak, there's a review taking place in CARICOM in our common external policy and our rules of origin policies. And we are not hearing much about that from the government in the administration, but I do hope that the administration recognizes that if such a policy as is being discussed, and if this motion were to be passed, that we need to look very carefully at what is taking place at CARICOM in our common external policy and our common external tariff and our trade policy rules of origin review mechanism. These are vital to the supply side of that very critical equation. Where the food, how we adequately support the agricultural sector in areas like the dairy industry and the poultry industry is very critical to those developments taking place currently in CARICOM with the common external policy, the common external tariff and the rules of origin. So, for example, there has not been a common external tariff on dairy from time immemorial. Reason? That we have pursued as a region a very short-sighted policy of free milk powder, drawing down from and accepting very cravenly, from the milk powder that the European Union so heavily subsidized, and destroyed the dairy industry in the process in Jamaica. Only now to have the same Europe, because they recognize we are now vulnerable, having destroyed the same policies, having destroyed our dairy industry. The same thing is happening to a greater or lesser extent to the poultry industry. And in other, so this is what I'm saying. The ministries of industry is very critical, because the poultry industry is under threat. If we do not realize and come together with a coherent strategy and a trade policy to support it, we will be very shortly finding ourselves in very similar situations. And therefore, one of the recommendations I'd really like to make is that it's not good enough for us to focus solely on our domestic policy and strategy. We have to look to CARICOM to fix some of those policies. And Jamaica, it's high time that Jamaica begin to lead the CARICOM process on this issue, on this trade policy issue. Jamaica cannot be quiescent. We have the largest market. We have the most to lose and the most to gain if we focus our attention correctly where it needs to be put. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I want to urge that even as we support the motion fully, that it goes forward to one of the committees to look very carefully and to work through the integrated strategies and policies that must come together if we are going to have something that is sustainable at the end of the day. So with that, Mr. Moulton, with that contribution, Mr. Speaker, I say that the motion should be carried. I'm fully in support of the motion, and I thank the Speaker, the mover of this motion. Thank you.
May it please you, Mr. Speaker, I rise to make a brief contribution to the motion, which is resolving this Honourable House to debate and determining a policy for increased use of local produce in the school feeding programme. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the subject matter is of interest and that there is agreement across the aisle in respect of what needs to be done. I should, however, like to point out that there is, in fact, a food and nutrition security policy of the government of Jamaica, which was jointly done by the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries and the Ministry of Health. It's a 72-page document dated March 2013. And it covers all of the issues raised by the speakers so far. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, the policy document at the executive summary speaks to the philosophy and objective of the policy. And it also speaks to specifically what the policy seeks to do. And what is listed in the document is that it will ensure that a sufficient quantity of nutritious food of appropriate quality is available to all people in Jamaica through increased domestic production and a sustainable level of imports, food availability. To ensure that all individuals in Jamaica have access to adequate resources to acquire appropriate food for a nutritious diet, and it sets out other details. To ensure that all individuals in Jamaica reach a state of nutritional well-being through food choices and consumption that reflect recommended dietary allowances, food utilization. And it goes on to say how the policy is delineated in 4 sections: food availability, stability of food supply, food access, and food utilization. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, it also sets up an institutional framework. So it does appear that we're suffering from what has been often complained about, that within government the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, because at the end of the day, much work went into this policy under the administration under which the member was a member of the cabinet. And so I just wonder about, when so much time and effort is put into work and follow-up is to be done and it is not done, whether we're going to retraverse the ground. It is clear that the subject matter is of interest, but the work that this Parliament is called upon to do, that substantially has already been done. May it so please you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this motion. And in supporting the motion, Mr. Speaker, and following on what the previous speaker just said, I want to focus more on how we could implement the aspect that speaks to the use of local food in the nutrition of our school children. I'm not affair with all that is in that policy, but what is absolutely sure is that from a small farmer's perspective, and also from an investor's perspective in agriculture, one of the things that drives the decision is the demand. What will make this program work and what will make the motion feasible is, as my colleague from Western St. Andrews said earlier, is how will we be able to create the supply that is needed. Right, and Mr. Speaker, this supply would be driven, as was mentioned earlier, by a proper table and tabling of what would be the diet that we would want to offer in these schools, as that was said. Upon tabling that diet, then the minister and those in the agriculture sector would look carefully at what aspect of that program we can supply. We would then be required to mobilize the resources that we already have in terms of RADA and the JAS, to ensure that we match the productive systems and the supply chain with the demand that will arise from this demand in our schools. And this period would be a period of an exciting 10 months within which school is in session. And it could be so timed that the production would peak just about at the start of the school year. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, in terms of what would be required under that program. The vegetables, the staples, etc. Is that once we get that right, then I think that there's enough resources in terms of the agro-parks and the other areas to really synchronize the production. I don't think that what is being asked for in this motion is beyond our current capacity. What it does is that it enhances and creates a driver for an economic stimulus, primarily in the agriculture sector and for the farmers that will be so geared towards producing these products. And why I started this way, Mr. Speaker, is that if you look in the sector now and you look at those who are producing, I know for a fact, and there's data out there to suggest, that we have a very unreliable and a very unpredictable supply of agricultural produce coming from the sector. As the colleague says, the hotels complain, the exporters complain, and I also understand the level of spatial variability that is involved in agricultural productions. But as I said, it is not beyond us. It is not beyond the extension officers in RADA. It is not beyond us as a country to really study what is really required. And I think that this school feeding program, if we make it the mainstream driver, if you know, for most of us as Member of Parliament, when somebody comes to you and they come to you for like chickens or agriculture supply, you ask them, so where are you going to sell this product? A lot of them would tell you that they already talked to the principal and they're getting a little contract. It therefore means that there is an informal demand that this program would formalize under the auspices of the government, driven by the Ministry of Agriculture, to create that boost, because it will affect the primary producers that are greater in numbers out in the constituencies and across the country. The government would more have to be a facilitator of engendering that this level of production is sustainable. And my colleague from Northwest St. Elizabeth said it best. The incubators that are now built, 8 of them, that's one good place to start. They are there, they are sitting, and they are waiting. Another place to start, as mentioned, would be the school gardens. But in terms of making an investment and reliability of supply, the school gardens is good for bringing youngsters into agriculture and getting them to know the culture of agriculture and getting them into a culture of production. But to supply the number of students that will be demanding of this project, it's something that will require nothing less than the scale of a Minister of Agriculture sanctioning that particular project to ensure that the stimulus is given to the small farmers to produce. And that could be a driver in our economy. And the last point I want to make in support of the motion, because I really want it to work, is to integrate the whole issue of the agro-parks and the irrigation system, some of which I see in this year's budget. The focus this year was on onions and Irish potato, becoming self-sufficient in those. A next step would be to see how well those are incorporated into this program to create that demand and ensure that we have proper utilization of those agro-parks. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that in looking at the overall motion and the impetus to use local products is one that I think presents us with an opportunity beyond the nutrition of our children, but as a good merger and a good linkage between what a developed, direct and deliberate school feeding program would do on the agricultural sector and as a driver for our economy. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Bloomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise in support of the motion by the member from Central Kingston. I remember very distinctly the debate on that food safety and security, nutrition policy a number of years ago, and was able to participate in that debate. I support the motion because of its profound implications and its extensive ramifications. This motion is timely and challenges all of us as legislators and indeed participators in our communities to serious, interventionist, and even radical action. I applaud the holism that it implies today, even as the presentations of all our members have added distinct facets of this issue. I would like to contribute in a simple way. First of all, we need to start early. Early childhood and so on has been talked about for the last number of years and has impacted society and community at large. And now we understand that we ought to start as early as is possible. And nutrition is one of those areas which we can start. I moved a motion a couple of years ago concerning obesity, which, because of the legislative agenda, was not taken and was not debated. Why? Because I saw obesity as one of those factors which are going to be very critical in our country's development. Obesity, not only adult onset obesity, but childhood obesity, and the myriad implications that it has for our national development. Obesity as one aspect of it, because it is this kind of issue that leads to so many other non-communicable diseases: diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, which includes strokes, myocardial infarctions or heart attacks, congestive heart disease, kidney failure, sexual impotence, peripheral vascular diseases which results in amputations and limb disabilities, and we could go on and on. In other words, it has extensive, vast and critical implications for our of these diseases. Why an early childhood policy on nutrition? Why a school feeding program? It is critical because it is as we start early, as we believe in that public health principle which says that prevention is always better than cure. It is sometimes the best cure, and at other times the only cure. I remember earlier this year, and all of us will remember, that there is an International Fruit Day, that together, partnering with the College of Agriculture, Science and Education and partnering with the Early Childhood Commission, we went to every single basic school in the area and distributed ripe bananas. As we spoke to the babies and explained why it is important for them to begin to eat bananas and other fruits, and the impact was so great that we now know that we have to do that more than once a year, because it is a critical input and importance in how we go forward. Colleagues, Mr. Speaker, it is not just about the quantity of life because of the non-communicable diseases, but the quality of life. Because of the burden of healthcare that is preponderant because of a lack of feeding our children properly, adequately, and effectively. It is said we are a third world country, but the reality is that the first world countries also have this problem. And unless we get to the root of it, which is consumerism, we are not going to be going very far. The reality is that, one, many of us look at nutrition as a side issue. And so unless we begin to educate we mentioned about PTAs, we mentioned about school teachers, we mentioned about educators, we mentioned the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Agriculture, and all the linkages and partnerships and other whole, as I said, other representatives from community who need to participate. But one of the key factors is going to be the parents. It is going to be critical that we maybe institute an issue of education. And I don't mean education in terms of acquiring information and regurgitating that information, but an acquisition and sensitization of the information so that we can critically analyze the realities around us in order to transform the reality as we see them for the better of our communities and our nation at large. The world is affected by nutrition. One of the things that I have noted in sitting at my other workplace is that many persons, families come in, mothers in particular, with children. And even in the social setting, we find a number of parents who come and they are in need of so many things. But guess what? They have a baby in hand, a child, and the packaged food, the boxed drink, the bottled drink, or whatever it is, the number of calories that little child is already conditioned to consume is already a huge factor. Shift the focus, because when these children acquire that taste, it is almost impossible to stop. When you talk to parents and I advise them, number one, they say our local products, in the first instance, the presentation is not good. In the second instance, the quality is not up to par. And in the third instance, it is too expensive when they compare it to what is being dumped on us. So there are many factors why parents will resist even the very thought and the very idea of the interventions that we are promoting today. So we need to get to the heart of the critical issue of parenting and of the information and sensitization that is needed. How do we sensitize them? How do we communicate to them effectively? And how do we mobilize them in order to make it happen? It is good that we have all the ideas today, but it is not just the accumulation of the ideas, the packaging of the ideas. It is the continuity of effort and even the fixity of the purpose to make it happen that is going to effect real change. Today, as I stand here, I know that our parents are going to be critical in this. I know that our parents, even if we give information about fruits, basic idea of fruits, fruits come in different ways, and sugar comes in different ways. There is galactose and lactose, which is milk sugar, and milk itself will break down to sugar. There is fructose, which is in all the fruits, which are complex sugars, will break down to simple sugar or glucose. And because the body cannot store sugar, it will reconform it and store it as fat. And that is where the obesity comes from and the challenges arise. So if we continue to suggest that So many of our young people are getting obese based on fruits alone. So vegetarianism is not necessarily the answer. It is part of the solution. But when we begin to eat our mangoes, and we know how sweet our mangoes are, when we begin to eat nesberries and papaws and ripe bananas, and we could go on and on, some basic simple facts to our parents in terms of how they handle their children at home, and our teachers in terms of how they handle our children at school. For example, simple portion control. Our babies have huge plastic bags of imported food stuffs in their hands, huge bottles. And why would a 3 and 4 year old have a huge bottle of soft drinks when a quarter of that would have been necessary for the nutrition required, daily required nutrition? There is already information, a body of information in our national and regional bodies. The Caribbean Food and Nutrition Institute, for example, can tell us exactly how much calories is in each piece of whatever we want to know. The question is, are we monitoring the portion? That alone will eliminate 30, 40, 50, 60% of the sugars that are being acquired and ingested by our students, our children. And that alone already will cut our sugar content by 50, 60%. So that's one thing. The Jamaica Moves is a good and useful tool as well. So the combination of all these things will become necessary. So I am suggesting to all of us that we re-educate our parents, that, and of course all the extended families and caregivers, that we unlearn some of the things we have learned in the past, that we begin to take up real leadership in terms of those agencies that we have control over, the RADAs and the 4-H clubs and the school institutions and so on and so forth, in order to make it happen. I am suggesting that we begin the mobilization immediately, because I suspect that unless we do it from the parents' perspective, unless we, as the prime influencers and formers of culture in our children, that we get there immediately by influencing them more than influencing any other group to start with. Because what is the point in giving a child a wholesome, healthy, well-proportioned, balanced, pretty plate, as we call it, with all the fruits and vegetables that will attract them? They have that at school, and by the time they step through the door, the parent stops at one of the stalls or one of the shops, and the child is walking behind the parent with a huge drink of sugar and a huge bag of sugar. And by the time they get home, there's another set of sugar, and so on, and so on, and so forth. So we ought to be able to see where we are going, mobilize our parents, and get going, because the implications are awesome and ominous for our country. I support this motion, and I hope that it will produce the action that it deserves, and that the testing of this activity will be in all of us as representatives stepping out tomorrow and making at least one difference in our educational institutions at the early childhood level. Commit to it, act on it, focus on it, look at what are the achievables, and therefore measure them. And so at the end of a year, we can come back and say, listen, I did that because of this extremely wonderful motion, and my children in my constituency were the beneficiaries. Jamaica is the beneficiary, and good and wholesome health care has been delivered to our constituents. I commend it to you as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Montague.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, sir. Mr. Speaker, I rise to add my voice to this discussion that is before us. While I support the subject matter, Mr. Speaker, of the resolution, I am a little uncomfortable with the conclusion of the resolution calling for a debate to determine a policy but research shows, Mr. Speaker, that the policy already exists. and it's actually on the website of the Ministry of Agriculture. And I would commend, and I want to pause to commend, the crafters of the policy in 2013, jointly between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture at the time. I believe it was the member from Eastern St. Thomas was the Minister of Health, and the late Honorable Roger Clark from Central Westmoreland was the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, what I believe we should be doing is asking about the implementation, the progress on the implementation of the policy. And I would want to undertake to continue the lobby to encourage the current Minister of Agriculture and Education to speed up what they are doing, because they have been implementing sections of the policy that is already done and passed by this House. Mr. Speaker, for example, the Ministry of Health is well known for its activism in the Jamaica Moves program. The Ministry of Agriculture, of Education, in furtherance of the policy of 2013, is moving to pay for cooks in our canteens in our schools so that they can properly prepare nutritious meals. The Ministry of Education is reviewing the menu of NPL, and the Ministry of Agriculture under the current minister and the previous minister has moved to increase the amount of production incentives for our small farmers. So therefore, I support the subject matter, and I commend the member from Central Kingston for raising this matter at this time, because the subject matter still has relevance. And Mr. Speaker, the whole matter of increasing the content to making it more Jamaican in our school feeding programs ought to be commended. Mr. Speaker, what I would want to suggest, and I believe the member from North Trelawney skirted around the issue, is that many times good programs fail as it regards to our small farmers because the method of payment to our farmers is always doubtful and questionable. And I would want to suggest to the member from Central Kingston that he amends his resolution and seek to, as a part of the amendment, to call on the Ministry of Agriculture to carve out a piece of the production incentive to be sent to the schools or to the PC Bank in a clearinghouse situation so that the farmers can be properly funded so that when they produce, they can be paid. Because many times it is the lack of payment or the uncertainty of when it's going to be paid. For example, a lot of our farmers supply business places, restaurants, hotels, and 2-3 months before they are being paid. And what we would not want. No, things have improved, especially in the tourism area under Minister Bartlett. But Mr. Speaker, to guarantee, as the member I think from North Trelawney pointed out, that the school garden alone can't work. And I support him on that point. And therefore, that is why I'm saying, if we are to involve the wider community, and it could be done, member, by saying, let us first look at the persons who are members of the PTA to be getting into contract things, because if the person is supporting the school voluntarily and you're going to pay, why not use that as a means of encouraging participation rather than you go to a dead stranger who is not participating in the life of the school? So I would want to commit to continue to encourage the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Education, the Minister of Health to continue to look at the policy that is already approved by the House and to continue to implement its provisions. And I am sure that this government, during its time for this term and the next term, will continue to implement the provisions of the policy. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the member from Central Kingston for raising the subject matter, but ask him that because the policy is already there, nobody calling for a debate and to determine a policy. That's why I'm asking for an amendment. It's the implementation that which I believe both of us are at one, on the implementation. And I support you on the implementation and would want to suggest the whole matter of use, whether of some of the path payments or some of the production incentive, to go into a pool to help to pay the farmers that will produce for this program, if it so pleases you.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, just as I observe that has been transpiring in this House, there's a term used, as it so pleases you. I'm unfamiliar with the term in the House. I am familiar with it in the court. So I ask those learned, I ask those learned colleagues to just simply say, make reference to you as the Speaker. All right. Having said that, and hopefully we'll have no more of that kind of utterance in the House. Mr. Speaker, I now call on the member of Central Kingston, who did not, he gave notice that he intended to move the motion today, dealing with the UTEC matter. So I call on him now, Learned Counsel and Member of Parliament. You've suspended both, two motions, you know.
No, you have suspended the debate that's been going on now.
Oh, yeah. But no, he had enjoined it in his presentation, you know. He can do both at the same time if he says so. I am not convinced that a member cannot rise to address both resolutions standing in his name if he gives notice thereof, which he did. I would like to be challenged on the subject, but I am not convinced that it cannot be done. However, if you wish, Mr. Speaker, I will ask that this motion, as discussed with the member, be suspended until next Tuesday. And I trust that the member the Minister of Agriculture, I know, has expressed an interest in making a significant contribution. This will be about his fourth major presentation in the House debate this year. So we anxiously await that presentation. So, Mr. Speaker,
those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
We now call on the member to proceed with the other resolution standing in his name.
Reverend Waits.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much, and for the indulgence of the House as the shades of evening draw near. Mr. Speaker, this is motion number 47, and while the other motion just taken was 2 years old, this has grown a beard of 1 year. It was moved on in November, almost 1 year, November 2017. This is September 2018. It reads, whereas the course of studies offered by the Faculty of Law of the University of West Indies has been accredited by the University Council of Jamaica, and whereas the majority of UTEC law graduates are unable to access professional courses offered by the Council of Legal Education due to constraints of space at the Norman Manley Law School and suffer great disadvantage thereby, and whereas the University of Technology Jamaica is able to recruit experienced faculty and other resources to properly equip a quality professional law school. Be it resolved that the Jamaican Parliament support the establishment of a law school at the University of Technology, Jamaica, and encourage government to advance this position at the next CARICOM Heads of Government meeting with a view to its acceptance in accordance with the relevant treaty before the start of the next academic year. And be it further resolved that after debate, this resolution be referred to the Human Resources and Social Development Committee of Parliament so that further consultations may be undertaken. Mr. Speaker, so as will happen in many of the presentations of the motions that have been on the table for many months, if not years, you find out that the events have overtaken some of the provisions thereof. And this is the case in this instance. However, there's merit in raising it because the intent of the resolution, which is to seek bipartisan support for the establishment of a law school at the University of Technology before the start of the next academic year, which would have been in September, this September, has not yet been achieved. I'd like to point out some salient facts. First of all, over the last 10 years of its existence, the University of Technology has graduated some 700 students in law. And yes, and 500 of them have been denied the opportunity for certification as attorneys at law because of the paucity of law school places available. And I believe that this is unnecessary and cruel and a cramp on the legitimate aspirations, and more than aspirations, Mr. Speaker, the investment that they have made in legal training. I am aware that there is a committee, I believe convened by the Ministry of Education, to achieve the intent of this resolution, but neither the University of Technology, with whom I have consulted, nor this Parliament knows the state and stage of that discussion. And the intent of this resolution in these circumstances at this time is to ensure that the necessary provisions, legislative, regulatory, and otherwise, are made in time for the establishment of the law school in January 2019. This is the intent of all that I'm advancing here today. The urgency for this is obviously connected with the statistics I just gave. There are many, Mr. Speaker, I hope you're not one of them, who feel that we have too many lawyers, or a great many lawyers already in the society, indeed an oversupply. We shouldn't have that view. First of all, let the number of persons who in the various... There is a unique opportunity that we have. We can determine the practice of law and define it in very traditional terms that we are familiar with specialties of one sort or another. But the 21st century and the modern economy create the opportunity for us to conceive of the practice of many professions, and law is the one we are concentrating on in this resolution, integrated with and akin to those trends of modern economy, particularly in the areas of for short known as STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, which particularly are the charism and the purview, particularly of the University of Technology, Jamaica. In other words, this law school that we are suggesting, and indeed its faculty of law has already begun to enter into this reference, is not just doing the traditional law subjects as we have understood them in classic legal education, but rather going further and determining the interposition of legal principles in the aspects of vocational, technical, scientific education of which they are particularly adept. You know, Mr. Speaker, I follow the jurisprudence of Ronald Dworkin and John Finnis, who speak beyond the positivism of law that's enacted in this Parliament and established and adjudicated by the courts, of this broad texture of legal principles, which in fact invade the sinew of every activity of the state and of the individual. And accordingly, there are a wide variety of jobs, legal professional aspects, which we don't really conceive of normatively now, but in fact have a very important role in national development and in the achievement of personal ambitions. And therefore, we shouldn't worry that a lot of our young people aspire to be lawyers. And particularly if they choose to be exposed to the discipline of law in these new and creative environments, which I believe the University of Technology Law School would provide. We must use power when we have it, you know, Mr. Speaker, not to disable, but rather to enable. And we have for long as a society understood that it was unfair to have these students preparing themselves with the ambition of legal certification and yet being unable to do so because of the regulations that we had originally put forward for this profession. And so I'm moving that, but there's a somewhat broader context which I also want to mention. You know, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a law school at the University of Technology, Jamaica, but there is a fundamental injustice that's being done at that institution. And again, it transcends any particular administration. It is something that is of great importance to all of us. When you look at the allocation of state funds to the University of Technology, you will find that the allocation that government makes, previous government, present government, governments before the last this and the last administration, the allocation per student to the University of Technology students is about 30% of what the University of the West Indies student gets. And yet we expect that the University of Technology will produce the same quality and range of outcomes as its sister institution. And similarly, if we look at the other institutions of higher education in Jamaica, again, the University of Technology is on the lower end of institutional assistance. Now, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I'm not suggesting that anything be taken away from any of the other institutions, but I am urging government, and I would be pleased for a response affirmatively in the course of the debate of this motion, that they would abate the injustice of which we are speaking. The University of Technology deserves to be given by the state, so long as we continue the present modality of funding tertiary education, to be put on a reasonable and equal par with the other institutions. Their salaries of their lecturers are depressed. They find it very difficult to attract personnel with terminal degrees because, in fact, the money is short. And they have, in fact, had to go into a number of areas which they might otherwise not have ventured into because they are trying to earn money from other sources. Could I just give you the figures, Mr. Speaker? Page 313 of the latest survey, Economic and Social Survey of Jamaica for 2017, indicates that the University of the West Indies per student, per capita, receives $520,190, whereas the University of Technology Jamaica is $152,568. I'm sure you see the distinction, and it cannot be explained. It's simply an anomaly that has to be developed, has to be changed. I'm urging that government be swift in intending this, and also it is important that the consideration both of the law school and of the general enablement of the University of Technology take place within the context of a full and broad discussion about the philosophy, purposes, and modalities of tertiary education in 21st century Jamaica. You know, Mr. Speaker, we haven't really done that before. Certainly not in this House, to the best of my energies and thoughts. We now need to look at it in a holistic way and in terms of how our institutions collectively are dividing the available resources, catering to the required needs, and being seen as institutions of quality which can in fact attract the attention of students, the interest of students, and also meet our human resource needs. Referring finally to the issue of the law school, Mr. Speaker, the intent of the University of Technology, fully understanding the ramifications of the Caribbean nature of the way legal education has developed, are seeking the approval of the government so that they can in January begin a program to ensure that their graduates of the law school proposed will in fact be able to practice in Jamaica. Let us do that while our government, through the CARICOM machinery, sees to the wider certification of those graduates in the broader Caribbean region, as others are so entitled to do. This is a matter that I think can easily gain the support of our members, and I'm really asking that the necessary steps be taken with a timeline in mind, that is, to facilitate the opening of the law school.
I ask that they suspend the resolution for another day, and we undertake to have the responses to it when we next meet, so that we can go on to the matter that will be handled by the member from Western Westmoreland. And in furtherance of my view that we can take all of the reports together, I ask that we enable the member to take, standing in his name today, the reports on the motion number 9, 10, 11, 21, 22, and 26 together, collectively. So if that satisfies you, Mr. Speaker, I ask that you so rule.
The question is that the debate be suspended. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Member from Western Westmoreland, Mr. McNeil, Dr. McNeil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I start, through you, I want to address something that was said by House Leader earlier, and I think it's something. Mr. Speaker, as you know, the PAAC, Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, deals with current matters. At the end of the financial year, we usually have a little carry-on, but then we move back to the current financial matters. The PAC then takes a sort of retrospective under the guidance of the Auditor General. So basically, a lot of the reports that we are reviewing, to be effective, they have to be dealt with in a timely manner. Today, the House Leader spoke about taking 5 and the fact that he would like the committee to, for me to take these reports now. I think, Mr. Speaker, I would just make one point to the House Leader. I'm very happy that he's starting to take some of these reports. If you notice, when we go back, the reports we're taking start from June 2016. It is not the committee who indicates when these things are debated, but the House Leader. And I'd simply like to make the point that I'm hoping that this is an indication, not that today we needed to fill the gap, but that we are going to seriously looking at taking the reports that have been tabled and taking them in a timely manner, because quite frankly, if we have the interim report, fiscal report that comes from the Ministry of Finance, it is of little value for us to be debating the interim report from October 2016 in September 2018. That makes very little sense, although some of the recommendations. So what I would ask is that I will urge the House Leader, and I will be a little more vociferous in doing it, that coming up shortly we will be doing the fiscal papers again. I will be seeking and urging that we get these reports in a timely manner. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of reports, whether it is the national security with the used motor car vehicles, which are outstanding, things that were done on the bushing programs, we have a list of reports that have to be debated, and we look forward to them. The House Leader has put 6 reports, and I think we can take some of them fairly quickly. And what I'm going to seek to do, the reports are tabled, and members can take the opportunity to look at the reports. What I'm going to do is simply highlight a few of the issues that I feel are germane today and the recommendations that apply still, and try and move as quickly as possible as we can with that. Mr. Speaker, in the list, number 1, there's number 9, which is the fiscal policy paper and the interim report financial year 2016-17. And at number 26, there is the report on the fiscal outlook for financial year 2017-18 and the impact of the tax measures on consumption. I'm going to start with your leave, Mr. Speaker, in taking those 2 first, as they are enjoined. Mr. Speaker, just in a brief, because there were a number of things. If you will recall, the fiscal policy paper interim report, this was tabled November 9th, 2016. And at that time, it was, sorry, Mr. Speaker, it was tabled in October 19th, 2016. And at that time, we had just gone through the budget exercise. We were now halfway through we were into the 2nd or 3rd quarter of the financial year. And I would just like to indicate what were the issues we found at that time. We found that the economic context for the period was reflected in the fiscal policy paper interim report 2016-17, which showed a quickening in the pace of economic growth from 0.3% in quarter 1, that's 15-16, growth had increased to 1.1 in quarter 1 of 16-17. However, some members of the PAC were concerned, however, that a shift by the government to a system of indirect taxation, which is widely documented to have regressive impact, could negatively impact low-income earners. So this was immediately after we had had the budget debate, in which the new tax policies had taken place, including additional taxes on gas, etc. And there was a feeling that these could have a regressive impact on growth. So our recommendations at the time, Mr. Speaker, were that 2 things: that in future, before introducing major policy changes with reported consequential impact, that the government of Jamaica should undertake analyses of its potential impact on the economy. It was one of the things that we recommended, and there was a long discussion on whether tax committee, which had been proposed previously, I think the leader of the opposition, and there had been discussions with the former Minister of Finance on it, whether these things should be discussed at length rather than just being imposed. And what we had asked to be done at the time was for a report to be done by PIOJ on the impact of the taxes, the new taxes, the indirect taxes on the economy. So, Speaker, I now move, just in keeping with that, to the following year, when the second report, which is report number 26, if I may, Mr. Speaker, I have to seek leave because I'm taking two reports and sort, yes, and joining them. The report on the fiscal outlook of financial year 17-18, which came the following financial year immediately after, and in which we had some information from PIOJ. At that time, Mr. Speaker, again, two things came out of that report, Mr. Speaker. The first was we were advised that there were several risks to the financial outcome at the time. However, these risks were partly mitigated by the continued strong performance under the precautionary standby agreement with the IMF. Given that natural disasters were a significant risk to the outturns, your committee considered the Caribbean had never received a payout from CRIF, segregated portfolio company, though there had been significant damages resulting from disasters. In reviewing the findings of a study by the PIOJ, and this was a study that we had asked to be done after the fiscal, we found that this study on the impact of the tax measures on consumption that were requested by the committee, it was found that individuals from the wealthier deciles would benefit more from the new tax measures. The members were concerned about the negative impact on the poor, particularly those who were not beneficiaries of the program of advancement through health and education path, and the committee further stated that based on this, they wanted another study to be done to show how the implementation of the tax policies and how we could mitigate against this negative effect on the persons. Just to say, Mr. Speaker, that report from the PIOJ is here. It was given to us on the 28th of April this year. We received it in May 17th. And it is titled, Who Benefits and Who Pays? And the committee will be looking at it. Just to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that it is something we need to look at, because just in the basic summary of it, it follows on the same discussion that took place at committee, that the new tax measures, these indirect taxes that have been placed, have a far more damaging impact on the poor than the wealthy, and that it is something that we must look at. The committee will be reviewing this, but we will be going forward. And I'm just tabling it here because it is something that, even though it is 2 years later, it is still of concern to us moving forward. So, Mr. Speaker, if I may, that would be the report number 9 and report number 26 that are before the committee. The third report, Mr. Speaker, is the report from the Ministry of Education. That report, Mr. Speaker, at the time, again, was immediately after we had the government had suspended the auxiliary fee, removed the auxiliary fees, or said auxiliary fees did not have to be paid. So that was brought up at the time, and it was in the midst of that discussion. Yes, the speaker, let me. Yes. There were a number of recommendations that were made here, Mr. Speaker. The real difficulty that some members had is that, and I sort of condensed in the report, that there was a concern amongst committee members that in taking away the auxiliary fees, or the way it was done, that some schools would be more affected than others, and it was felt that the traditional schools would be less affected than the non-traditional schools, and that there was a danger that if you do the program in this way, you may widen the gap between the traditional schools and the non-traditional schools. And so the committee had asked that this was something that we had to monitor and that needed to be looked at. There were a number of discussions that took place about the NYS, etc. Yeah, but that was the fundamental issue that came out about the Ministry of Education at that time. That's the third report, Mr. Speaker. The fourth report, Mr. Speaker, is a report that was done from the period June to July of 2016. And at that time, Mr. Speaker, we had taken a number of the commissions. Mr. Speaker, there are some things with that remain a problem, and I just highlight it. In discussion, we took the Cabinet Office, and in discussion with the Cabinet Office, one of the things that has come out, which is a recurrent problem, is the fact that a number of the ministries, departments, and agencies have not submitted their financial or annual reports on time, or at that time, many were overdue. Measures have been put in place, and I think we're far better off now than we were before. But it is something that is of concern, and I know that at the PAAC, we will be doing another review of the audited accounts moving forward. However, there was something, recommendations made that I think need to be put to the Parliament. Number one was to allow for greater monitoring, publish quarterly and biennial financial statements of the MDAs on the websites of the Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Finance, Public Service, and Parliament was one of the recommendations. And the second one was for the hiring of additional accounting and auditing staff if necessary to ensure that the reports are current. And Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons for that is that there's an argument that at the Auditor General's office, there just is not enough staff to do what needs to be done. There were two other things, Mr. Speaker, within the Commission of Parliament. We found that in the Contractor General's office, and I think the Minister of Finance needs to look at this, it said that they had some serious challenges because the effectiveness of them is somewhat compromised. The OCG, they said, had oversight for over 11,000 high-valued contracts. That in a year, they have over 11,000 high-valued contracts, but they only have 10 people to look over these contracts. And that is something that they wanted looked at. And the second thing that was there, Mr. Speaker, we also met with the ECJ, the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, I repeat, this report dates back to July the 13th, 2016, and I think this will be of great interest to the House Leader. The recommendation of the PAAC was that while the ECJ came to the meeting and complained about acute shortages of finance to carry out the necessary voter re-verification exercise, July 13, 2016. And the report that we are now tabling in 2018, the PAAC strongly urged the government to fund the voter re-verification exercise as this was fundamental to Jamaica's democracy. At that time, the estimated amount that they said at committee was needed was 2.2 billion for the exercise. So I don't know if it has gone up or, but Mr. Speaker, the fifth report is a report on the Ministry of National Security. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will just make a brief mention of one thing. At this point in time with the Ministry of National Security, the issue that we were looking at was a breakdown in the relationship between INDECOM and the Ministry of and the Jamaica Constabulary Force. We had recommended two things. The first thing that we recommended is that the JCF was to have gotten back to us. They were to do a costing for creating a 5 to 10 person team of attorneys and submit it to Parliament. And these attorneys would be used for assisting police personnel who are being investigated by INDECOM in the use of force incidents. So it was a recommendation we're making. And the second recommendation is that the relationship between the two, that the Internal and External Affairs Committee should look into them. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if that situation still remains the same. We have not heard as much contention between the JCF and INDECOM, but I do believe that the recommendation that the Internal External Affairs Committee meet with them is a good one. And I do not know also, I know there was some debate in here about the lawyers being used for the police force. And I still think it's a good idea. So, Speaker, the last report was a report on the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries at the time. And, Mr. Speaker, that at that time, there were some real problems at the ministry, and I'd just go through some of the matters reviewed at the time. Concerns were raised by members related to the following. At the time, we had those PMOs, the production marketing organizations, that were to receive the agricultural inputs. The receipts of agricultural inputs by unregistered groups, the disparity in the number of PMOs in each parish, and the disparity in the allocation of funds by PMOs in each parish.
The committee was advised that to qualify for agricultural inputs, a PMO should have at least one meeting, which should be attended by an extension officer, show an inclination for agricultural production, consist of a minimum of 15 members, 75% of whom must be registered farmers, and have an organizational management structure. We took note of the fact that allocations are made to groups that are registered within RADA, and that there were some groups which have been allocated funds that were listed previously. Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth, funnily, advised that the Minister of Industry, Agriculture, Commerce and Fisheries had requested approximately $23 million that had been allocated by RADA to the PMOs. They had indicated that it was to be locked down while this was being looked at. Subsequent to that, we understood that that program, the mechanism was reorganized and the PMOs were disbanded. But that had come up. And it was a recommendation of the committee that has been taken and the PMOs were thrown aside. So, Mr. Speaker, just as briefly as possible, the reports are tabled in Parliament. I've given the highlight. I think that a lot of the information for it to be of more use has to be brought in a more timely manner. I think what we can do, if we know what we're going to bring next week, I will even try and condense it even more, except for where we think that the information is still very pertinent. But not only that, I think that coming out of this discussion, House Leader, we have got to ensure that the reports that are dealing with current expenditure in the year should not just be tabled in the year, but must be debated during the year and not left to 2-3 years later when they have no real relevance to what is going on. With that, Mr. Speaker, if it so please you, I will. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I see no one attempting to respond. So I wish only to thank the member for cooperating by bringing these matters today, and that we will continue this process. And we take note of his recommendation, which actually is only a signal that we intend to engage in good governance, where we will bring the matter before the House when it is current. So, with that, Mr. Speaker, I must advise you that it is not intended to do any further business today, so I ask you to adjourn the House. No, nobody responded. We come ask for the approval of the report. Because there's nobody responding.
Mr. Speaker, so I move for approval of the House on the motions moved.
It won't be long.
So, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, we are not doing any further business for the day, so I invite you to adjourn the House until next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
What? Members, the House has not yet adjourned, and I'd expect that members would give us a chance to finish the House properly. Second. The motion is that the House be adjourned until the 2nd of October at 2 o'clock. Those in favor?
Please, Mr. Speaker, I'm just saying they should move to approve the reports. No, he never. No, I don't think it was. I'm just. Okay, good.
We recognize the motion and we say aye. Those in favor of the adjournment? I am being advised that, Minister, you're indicating that you...
You have a motion for adjournment? Yes. Was it served on you? Yes. If we are at the motion to adjourn, and we have already approved the report, then I will leave it alone, Mr. Speaker. But there was an aspect that was raised in your report. A singular aspect that was raised in your report.
Just a minute. Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just a point of order. Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Will you please advise the member, once the motion be accepted, you can't raise an issue on it, and it will be accepted. Mr. Speaker, point of order, Mr. Speaker. That point of order. You can't do it. Huh? Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Hold on. Just a minute. There's a motion on the floor for adjournment. And on the motion for adjournment, a member can rise to discuss an issue if it was served on you before the House convened. But I didn't ask your opinion. The issue is, a member can rise to an motion of adjournment if an issue was raised with you before and you gave consent for it to be done. And
Thank you, Mr. Warmington.
Hold on, let me finish. Let me finish. You didn't intervene yet. And if the chairman,
Mr. Warmington,
and if the chairman of the committee debate an issue,
Mr. Warmington,
with House accepts the thing, you can't debate anymore.
With great respect, please do not at this time. The motion is that the House be adjourned until the 2nd. Those in favor? Those opposed? This House stands adjourned until next week, Tuesday, at 2 o'clock.